And today, right now, in this video, this is the first part of the series that's going to teach you how to write the speech of rebuttal. So I've got my Module 3 open, and I've got my course pack ready to rock and roll, and you'll see that the Module 3 rebuttal speech is here. Now we're repeating, the reason this is so much shorter than the other one is we're repeating a lot of things that we've already done. So when we look at the outline, it's going to look familiar. You already know how to write an introduction and conclusion, so we're going to follow that same formula. Also, all of the things about delivery, like extemporaneous delivery, how to create note cards, how different modes of delivery, that's already been previewed for you in the previous module. So you can revisit that stuff since it's the same exact delivery. It's extemporaneous delivery for the rebuttal as well. But we're learning a different set of skills here that are going to build on the previous set of skills. So let's start by going through the items in the basic module items. And whereas the self-introduction speech and the epideictic speech that we're going to do both have a lot of popular models that we can look at that show kind of how my recommendations to you are already put into circulation just kind of generally in culture. This is a really unique speech because historically there is this thing called the persuasive speech, and a lot of speaking classes require this persuasive speech. And the persuasive speech is just you stand up and you give an argument about why you're right about something. It could be like why you should buy the iPhone over the Android or whatever. Here's the thing though, unlike the self-introduction and the epideictic, which most of us give throughout our lifetimes in different forms, persuasive speeches are sort of not used anymore unless you are a congressperson or become the president, or I don't know, you have to, you're a lawyer, right? And you have to do a closing statement. That's a good example of a classic persuasive speech. But what we do more often now is we argue. And I don't necessarily mean that in the negative way that people mean it when they say like, oh, kids don't argue. I mean, you present arguments about why certain ideas are correct and certain ideas are incorrect. And you read things and you respond to them. And so what I want to teach you to do in this model is to be a responsible arguer, to analyze and deconstruct someone else's opinion, and to be able to present counter evidence and use argumentation strategies to take apart someone else's argument. It's very easy to stand up. So like veganism versus eating meat, for example. So veganism is just not eating any animal or animal byproducts. So no honey, no meat, obviously no eggs, no dairy, right? So there's a lot of argument going on right now about whether or not people should adopt a vegan lifestyle. So you could easily just stand up there, say, everyone should be vegan, find like the first 3 Google sources that you read and call it a day. But that's not a good model for persuasive communication because you're essentially writing persuasive speeches for people who already believe in you. So I don't want you to argue your opinion because that's not hard to do. What I want you to do is find a competing opinion that you don't agree with that's still reasonable, and I want you to take it apart. So for example, if you want to argue against veganism, you might find someone who makes a clear, interesting argument for veganism. For example, there's a new documentary out called The Game Changers. It's on Netflix. You can watch it, and it's about the benefits of a plant-based diet. If you want to argue against that, then that would be one of the sources, and you would write the speech taking that speech apart. But you don't make an argument for why eating meat is good, because that's an easy thing to do. You instead make the argument why the argument that your opponent is making for veganism has sort of rhetorical problems. So the rebuttal speech is something I sort of made up because ideally what we would do is we would spend this whole class like having debates and doing arguments, but there's just no way to get that done in a public speaking class. So I sort of invented a speech that practices a series of skills. So while you may never give this speech for real, like this exact speech, you will take parts of these skill sets and use them in all kinds of things, whether it's arguing why you should get a raise at work, or whether it's writing a blog post, arguing against another position, or whether you have to look at a speech for another class and take apart its rhetorical moves. I mean, whatever, it's a skill set that you're going to use for all kinds of endeavors. All right, so obviously there's the assignment description in the course pack, and that is on page 44. So we want to read through that. And then I want you to read this article on page 172 from The Atlantic called "This Article Won't Change Your Mind." And one of the things that this points out is that we are not persuaded by facts. And this is something very important because most of the time when left to your own devices, if I say write a persuasive speech, you write down an argument you have, like become vegan, and then you just come up with a bunch of statistics. But people don't make decisions based on statistics. I'm not saying you shouldn't use a good statistic here or there, or that scientific research has no place. Obviously it does. But if you're not using those things to undermine fundamental belief structures and identity structures and all of these intangible ways that people make decisions, you are not going to be persuasive. And then the other three things, these are the sort of like what I would call the theoretical underpinnings of this assignment that you're going to need to learn about. And right now we're going to do sort of an overview of the rebuttal speech. And then in the next video, I'm going to talk specifically about this question of stasis, and then also about the Toulmin model, which is the basic model of argument. So if we scroll over to the rebuttal speech, you'll see it's about a 5-minute speech where you're going to use different argumentation skills that we'll discuss in upcoming videos. It replaces the traditional persuasive speech, focusing more on engaged persuasion with an actual argument instead of just making up why you're right about things. So you want to write the speech about 5 minutes. You're going to do it extemporaneously with note cards, just like the previous speech. You still need to write a full sentence, full content outline. And the most important thing is you have to decide what argument you're going to argue against, and then you have to find a couple of sources that support the counter argument. You are not looking for sources that support your argument right now. You are looking for an opposing argument and a couple of reasonable sources that make that argument. So like I said, if I am doing an argument against veganism, then my sources could be this Game Changers documentary, or I could choose from this kind of handy little news site where there's the mainstream press in the middle, minimal partisan bias, and then there is skews liberal and skews conservative. I want you to stay, generally speaking, in kind of this middle realm here. I want you to avoid the hyper-partisan, utter garbage parts of this, all right? And you can see there's The Economist, Wall Street Journal, NPR, BBC, New York Times, Reuters, USA Today, CNN. So this gives you a wide swath. So I might want to go to The Economist website, or go to Vox's website, or go to The Hill's website, or go to Reuters, or go to CNN, and I might want to look up what kind of arguments they're making in favor of veganism, because I want to compile what are other people saying are reasons to become vegan, because I'm going to argue against those. So that's kind of step one. And then it's evaluated same way as always, right? We want you to take apart an interesting but reasonable counter argument. So I don't want you to take apart crazy conspiracy arguments. Like, for example, I wouldn't want to argue against someone who argues that veganism is a form of governmental mind control, because that's insanity. So you want, like, reasonable arguments. Like, for example, historically, most people have eaten plants is an argument in favor of veganism. Human beings do not have a protein in their body to digest dairy. There's an argument for veganism. Farming animals is really bad for the environment. There's another argument in favor of veganism. So we're looking for reasonable arguments that are actually kind of convincing, because I don't want you to take apart the low-hanging fruit. I want you to take apart good opposing arguments. You want to make sure that you organize the speech well. That's why we use the template. Again, we're back to our supports. You want to use a lot of good concrete evidence, not just statistics, but your analogies, your narratives, your testimony, right? All that stuff we talked about in the previous video. You want to write in ways that enhance your content. That means active word choice, minimal adjectives, avoid long lists. And as you're writing your outline, you want to write the way you're going to speak, which means your sentences should be relatively short. We're not going to use a lot of ands and embedded clauses and commas. We're going to write in ways that mimic how we speak, because when we speak, we only have so much breath. We can't say a lot of things before we have to breathe. And then your delivery, same as last time. Conversational, well-paced at 160 to 180 words a minute. Minimal distractions, and we want you to be engaged and interested and conversational. Doesn't mean you have to be theatrical, but I want to see that you are invested in what you are talking about. All right, so that is the assignment description, and you need to choose an actual argument. So I don't want to hear some argument you heard somewhere. I want you to find the actual argument. Circulating in popular political culture. And, if there's an argument on Facebook that you have read that you think would be a good thing to argue against, I'm not saying that you can't do anything else besides this list, but this chart is a really good starting place. But, if you read a blog post, or you saw a Facebook ad, or you watched a documentary, like I mentioned, and it seems reasonable and well-researched and not crazy conspiracy stuff, then use it. I trust you. All right, so that's it for the assignment description. So we want to go through that whole thing. And now we've got the sample rebuttal speech as well to look at. So I haven't done this assignment very many times, so I will say the sample rebuttal speech is maybe not ideal, but it's very good. I mean, if you can do this, I'll be happy. But since this is a new assignment for me, it's not as developed as I'd like it to be. So you can see there's a video of the sample rebuttal speech, and you can see that there is an outline. And so we can just kind of look at the outline real quick. But I'll let you do most of this on your own, but I'll kind of zoom through it to show you how it works. All right, so first of all, we have our warm-up and our audience connection. So there's a little anecdote that the speaker gives about them traveling to school when they were younger to take a standardized test, something that we all likely are familiar with. And sort of this audience connection about how standardized testing, you know, we've all kind of been in that panicky, like, why do I have to do this sort of move? And, you know, not just in grade school, but, you know, even in college, right? Obviously, like, standardized testing is still sort of a thing. Then the thesis is pretty simple. Whereas in the speech of self-introduction, you have to work really hard to find your central idea because you have to find your value and you have to find, like, what about you want to talk about. In the thesis, it's pretty straightforward because you're just like, I rebut the argument that blank, right? So in this case, this person is rebutting an argument entirely by one source. I don't love that. I'd rather it's multiple sources, but you are arguing basically against the fact that standardized testing is an effective way or a good way to measure whether or not people are smart. Right? So other people argue standardized testing is good for measuring intelligence, and you're simply saying that it's not. Now, I think this is sort of a weak argument because I don't think most people think standardized testing is a good way to measure intelligence. I think people think it's the best we can do, and it's the only way to create the same set of standards sort of across systems. So when they wrote to me that this is really what they wanted to argue, I kind of said I don't love this. But they really wanted to do it. They really thought standardized testing was sort of like the devil, and they really wanted to argue against it, so I let it slide. But I will say, unlike, like, I'm not a vegan, for example, but I'm compelled by the argument that veganism is, that being more vegan is important. I don't do it. I'm not a vegan, but I'm compelled by the argument. I'm not compelled by the argument that standardized testing is a great measurement of intelligence. So this one is a little bit weak. I think there are more controversial arguments this person could have chosen. You want to choose an argument that you kind of understand why someone would believe that. You don't want to just choose an argument that you know is wrong, because that's not really argument, that's just entrenched belief systems. So, like, a good example might be, like, abortion's a good example. I am pro-choice. I can see why people don't think there should be third-term abortions. So in New York State, third-term abortions are legal. I can understand why people don't agree with that. I agree with it, but I can see the limitations of my perspective. So making an argument about third-term abortions would be a good one for me because I kind of see where they're coming from. All right, and then the difference, one thing that's different between this speech and the last speech is you're going to need a preview statement. Why do you need a preview statement? Because this speech has main points. Your last speech was short. It didn't have main points. It just had the one idea. But in this speech, you're going to have more than one idea. You're going to have 3 main points and 1 thesis. I'm sorry. You're going to still just have the one idea, right? You're still just going to have the one thesis that you argue against standardized testing. And you don't just say I argue against standardized testing because that's not an argument. That's just a thing. I argue against the argument that standardized testing provides an objective testing experience to measure preparedness to succeed, right? There's a very specific argument. And then you have 3 main points that you need to address. So the preview statement just tells the audience, hey, these are my main points. And they're in the same order. So whatever main point 1 is, that's your first main point for the preview statement. Whatever main point 2 is, that's your second main point up in the preview statement. And the preview statement is not sexy. It's just like, hey, I've got 3 main points, boom, 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 and you lay them out very specifically. It's a roadmap, right? It's telling the audience over the next 6 minutes, these are the 3 main points. These are the walls of my house. These things will help keep you anchored so you can kind of recognize them as you move through the speech. They're like your business agenda. You really want to have them there. It's part of staying organized for yourself and for the listener. If you don't have them, it's going to negatively impact your disposition arrangement, right? Your organization. And then you create your main points, which I'll talk about. You're going to have 3 different types of main points, which I'm going to talk about in the next videos because you're going to write your main points one by one. You want to put them in order of weakest to strongest. So your weakest main point should be 1, and then the stronger, and then finally the strongest, because you want to end with the strongest main point. So even though I'm going to tell you which 3 main points you have to have, you can put them in any order you want. And then once you have your main points laid out, you need to have at least 2 pieces of supports. So, and you need to mix them up. They can't all be statistics and testimony, right? So here we've got some testimony, and here we have a second testimony. I don't love that. I don't like the piling on of testimony, but that's just how this particular main point worked. Then we've got a testimony, and we've got an analogy. I like that better, right? There's more variety here. And then we've got another testimony, and we've got a narrative. So we've got some variety. And I usually tell people 2 to 3 main points, or 2 to 3 pieces of support per main point. So this speech has 2 pieces of evidence per main point. You could have up to 3, but it's only a 5-minute speech, so you definitely don't have more time than that. And then same thing for the intro and conclusion. We do exactly what we did last time. We find a support that can be the warm-up. We don't use it anywhere else in the speech. We use it to connect with our audience before we bring in our thesis. And then at the end, we recap our thesis, and then we create some psychological closure by revisiting the opening supports. So that's a basic layout of the sample rebuttal speech. You will find after you finish this module, when you go into module 3, all right, you go into module 3, the assignment for submit rebuttal outline draft. Just like last time, you're given the opportunity to submit a rebuttal outline draft just for feedback, right? It's not graded. You will see that there is a rebuttal speech outline template there. And so you're going to visit the Google Drive folder, you're going to go in there, you're going to choose file, you're going to make a copy, right, the whole shebang. Then you're going to draft your outline for the rebuttal speech, and then you're going to copy the link to your draft, and you're going to put it here. So it's a 2-step process, right? You got to create the outline, and then you also have to put it in the assignment Dropbox. And so the outline for the rebuttal speech is right here. You can make a copy, and then you can make it your own. If you make a copy, it'll be in the folder where it needs to be. You just need to submit the link to Canvas. And you'll see it looks very similar to the last speech. The introduction is almost identical, except there's a preview statement. That's the only new thing. And then you have 3 main points that you have to make. You don't have to make them in this order, but you have to make these 3 kinds of claims. And then you have 2, maybe 3 supports for each one. So your template looks, and then the conclusion looks the same. So there's your template, which should look pretty familiar. So I'm going to end this video now, which is the overview video of the assignment. And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about how do you write these main points. And so the first video is going to be about the fact claim and the stasis slip, because those are related, since they're all related to this idea of stasis theory, which we'll talk about in the next video. And then in the third and final video, we're going to talk about the Toolman model and how you use the warrant of the argument to deconstruct an opponent's position. So those are the 2 videos coming up to teach you those skills. You can get started on the speech first if you want. If you want to, I think it would be helpful if you went now and found the argument you want to rebut and maybe read 1 or 2 sources. Certainly, if you haven't read that article from The Atlantic, this article won't change your mind. You really need to read that because it kind of goes over the whole attitude behind writing this particular speech. And then when you're ready, tune back in to videos 2 and 3 for the actual nitty-gritty of how to line up these particular main points.